All right, so we are here, our last installment of the Preaching Collective, our season going through Loved and Not Forgotten. Loved and Not Forgotten. Looking at four women featured in genealogy of Jesus. And so for this last one, we're looking at Bathsheba. And yeah, this is an interesting one because of how little we actually know about her in the biblical story. Like we don't hear her voice a whole lot. And so I've been sort of thinking through that. And almost sort of using her to think about just the series in general, and almost how her story ends up being just representation of a lot of women's stories and people in general, in terms of how they sort of get absorbed into the circumstances around them, right? And viewed a certain way. And in many ways, she's sort of the quintessential example, I think, of how the Lord always sees and always knows and uses our stories. So basic kind of framework of how I'm thinking about this is, first of all, how Bathsheba is almost a woman who's swallowed up by the men around her. And so when you read her story, I've been thinking about it for a while, and how you have what David does with her. You have what happens with, she's just sort of almost like she's at the center of the story, and yet people sort of operating around her, right? And there's murder that happens around her, adultery. She doesn't see her husband for a long period of time. He's out fighting. There's all these sort of political manipulations and secrets that are trying to be sort of tamped down, but then that surface. It cost her personally. Of course, as we know, Bathsheba commits adultery with David and bears a child. That child dies as a result of God's judgment, really, on David. She ends up having another child, but so you see the personal cost. But she's just sort of, I think, swallowed up by the men around her. And I think that's just sort of a statement of, in many ways, you can look at all the different women in this way, how they kind of how often people feel like they're just ping pong balls, just being tossed around here and there. So I have sort of that perspective, but then, she's almost a woman swallowed up by her own decisions. And so we don't have enough to know on this.
You say swallowed up by her own decisions.
Exactly.
In what sense?
I was struck by this, interestingly enough, by shout out to Jason Bartley Jr., who Junior, right?
Shout out to Jason,
who's been doing animated videos for each of these.
Be on the lookout for those.
Yeah, so the video he did for Bathsheba of her sort of looking in the mirror, and sort of almost reflecting and thinking about how she came to this point. Is it just the men around her? And I think largely it is. But it is worth, it's not answered, and so I don't want to sort of land one way or another. I resist sort of some of the direction in some circles to just make her seductress, right?
Victim or vixen?
Yes, victim or vixen. And I think I would argue many sort of story, some context, land more in the vixen sort of viewpoint. I think she's more of a victim.
I was going to say, I think she's more of a victim in this sense.
Yeah, so I think so too.
The language seems to support that, I think.
Yeah.
But that's what this is for. We can talk.
Yeah, right. We can talk about it. Yeah, I would say the language is unclear as to what her culpability was, which is to say that.
But David was looking at her. She was getting dressed, right?
Yeah, but the Old Testament law is something that binds all people, including David. Did she have any agency or ability, and are there examples of this in the Bible of people who do, maybe the people in power try to manipulate them and take control of them, and yet they defy them, right? They say, well, no, this is what the law says. Think of like Ahab with, what's his name? The guy who wanted the vineyard of Naboth, I think was his name.
The First Kings?
Yeah, it's First Kings.
First Kings 21, I think.
Oh, look at you.
Come on, talk heavy.
All right.
I mean, trying to get ready for these.
Look at seminary boy. Yeah, Naboth. Naboth, I was right. So Naboth's vineyard, King Ahab says, give me that vineyard. And he basically quotes the law to him, right? He says, I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers. The law said that you keep your inheritance, right? You can't give land to a king, right? Even if it's the king asking you. So,
I would say even in that though, just remember, we're also talking about that's a man versus a woman.
Fair.
And so, intimidation is a real thing. Yeah,
you're right. So I'm glad you bring that up.
Especially to a king.
Yeah.
Oh gosh.
Yeah. No, you're right. So I think, so maybe this is my question. I think it's mostly her as a victim. Is it wrong to speculate that to what degree does she have sort of question at any point, is it hard to imagine that she questioned, how did I get in this place? Did I have a way out? Maybe I didn't, but maybe, I don't know, maybe I could have resisted. Maybe I could have not, but I'm not, but I was a victim. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I think there's, I don't want to go too far down that road. So this is why I'm looking at you, Chris, to kind of help me through this.
King David was a peeping Tom.
Well, yeah.
He
was
a pervert.
Yeah, so that's true. So because that's the other thing I want to say too. I think that's clear in the sense of, as I've been in some contexts where they said, well, she should have been bathing on the roof. Well, no, like that's.
But it's, I mean, the text says that she was going through purification, which we know in times past, if a woman was on her menstrual cycle, then 7 days later you go and bathe, and you have to actually bathe.
Yeah.
And so some people say that that's, it was a time of like her cleansing, like she's literally like cleansing. But then also David's supposed to be at war. Like, would she even think like, like he's like completely like, dude, you're like out of pocket all the way. Like you should be at war.
Top.
And you're taking a nap. Right? So even then, like,
that's good. Yeah.
Like
that's a good
from the
detail.
jump, he wasn't supposed to be there.
No, you weren't supposed to be
and the question I always had
he's
was,
he's the one who pushes this narrative. He's the one who sets the train going.
Yeah.
I mean, in many ways. So what this is, when Jesus says, far be it, it would be worse for you to, better for you to have a millstone around your neck than for you to cause one of these little ones to sin.
Yeah.
So, because there is a sin of adultery there. However, she's caused to do it by David
because he's the king and what he ordered.
He said he took her. He ordered his messengers to.
When he said he took her, like, what does that mean? Because I've heard some people say like they can even argue that maybe rape.
Yeah,
I've heard that.
I've heard that too.
I mean, probably got to do some more research, but I've heard that language could potentially mean that took her could also mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's ancient Near East, and so I think, we would define it certainly the way in our culture we would define it that way. He's acting like an ancient Near Eastern king at that point. I think
the law would speak to, not to be hoarding wives and things of that sort to yourself.
If she wasn't married, I think he could have almost gotten away with it.
Yep.
Right. Which doesn't make it right.
Sure.
Because he wasn't even he had cocky minds, all this type of thing, and obviously not according to what God set up originally. But the fact that he had to sort of he got with her and then immediately started having a plan to cover it up.
Oh yeah,
made him realize
to cover up his sin.
Yeah, he can't. This is not something. Even him acting like ancient Near Eastern king, he's still a Jewish king. Yeah. Right. He realized I gotta do something to try to cover this up.
Yeah, it seems like he only covered it up when he found out she was pregnant, which also would suggest like. Yeah. So it was okay, let me take you away with you, and then she's like, yo. Yeah. You knocked me up, bro.
That's a great point.
Now comes the plan of like, okay, let me get this dude back. Right. Like David is so off on this. I mean, no, for real. Like, I'm so mad at David at this point. Yeah. But then even when Nathan like comes and rebukes him, it suggests Nathan's like, you took like in his whole parable, like you took the sheep, like, dude, you had like a whole flock over here, dude, but you went and took this one man's. So and
then put him on a battlefield for him to get killed.
Come on.
Let's just be honest. Like, I know he's King David, man after God's own heart. He wrote Psalm 51. Yes. I know all that type of stuff. But like, when we look at this, it's like, bro, what's going on here? It's like, are you even, you know what I'm saying? Are a believer? Like this, seems.
Well, he breaks pretty much all the 10 Commandments. If you sort of go down every single one of them, if you you can kind of look at it in a lot of different ways. That he all of them he either explicitly breaks or very much sort of by breaking one breaks the other ones.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
Wow.
So how do you intend to sort of tease out the storyline, and then are there certain sort of takeaways that you feel like you want people to grasp by the end of it?
Yeah,
because the narrative itself is really strong, and there's a ton in there. All the things that David did. Obviously, we know about the restoration, but there's a lot that goes on, and there's still some consequences that he still has to endure.
Yeah.
I think there are lessons in that in regards to sometimes the way we can really get off in certain things, and sometimes the way we frame other people who are going off.
Right. I'm okay potentially exploring that. I think I'm actually leaning towards not necessarily going in that direction because it emphasizes David.
Right.
You would emphasize Bathsheba.
Exactly. So we tell the the story as it shows up in 2 Samuel does emphasize David. It's David's story.
It does.
And so almost anyone who features in 1st, 2nd Samuel features to the degree in which they sort of tell, highlight God's telling the story of David, and these other people are sort of involved in different ways. Yeah. What's interesting in this series is trying to tell this. Basically, we're preaching Matthew 1, really, right? That's what the series is,
right?
And so Matthew 1, we're saying so Bathsheba is in the story of Jesus. Why? And so we're looking back. Right. So through the lens of Matthew 1, I'm thinking, how should I look back? Why would the the writer of Matthew, why would Lord have this woman featured? What does he want us to see as we look back?
And it just says too, like in Matthew, it says the wife of Uriah.
Yeah,
it doesn't even.
Yeah,
it doesn't even say Bathsheba, which is interesting because Tamar's in here. It says Tamar. It says Ruth, right? It says Rahab, but this one doesn't say Bathsheba. It says, I mean, obviously it's the wife of. We know who, but it doesn't. It just says the wife of Uriah.
Yeah, I think it just shows how egregious that sin was, how bad it was, right? Yeah. That I think the Bible does sort of have a. I think the Bible speaks really strongly against certain sexual sins, and adultery is a big one, right? And so I think he's not ignoring that, and yet it's in the story of Jesus. So my early thought is just sort of, this idea of like God's control, right, over all things, over all situations, and a control over all our histories and past that lands more heavy on the side of grace and love and mercy than anything else, right? That grace, love, and mercy explain to me why. Here's a kind of story that like you want to ignore, hide, and yet Jesus says, "I'm using this to bring my Messiah," right? Yeah. How by faith, right, and what God is doing. This is why this becomes almost a capstone to the whole series. This whole genealogy is how God is weaving all these different stories together. Yeah, and how God even weaves this particular story in this woman who, actually, now that I think about this, I wonder in many ways this brings back agency to the woman, because if we only had the Old Testament, if we only heard about her from 1st, 2nd Samuel, we would basically not really know. We're not thinking of her much beyond just, she is, she slept with David because David wanted her as a kid, involved with some things with Solomon in terms of the lineage. There's also, we almost would view her simply in the lens of the men connected to her, right? Here now we're viewing her as one of the descendants of Jesus, and very clear descendant in the sense that like the Bible goes out of its way to mention her. And genealogies, as you know, like they don't normally mention women, right? And when they do, when a genealogy sort of has a very clear rhythm to it, like father, he's a father to this, and a father to this, and father to this, right? And he begat this son, and this son was a father, sort of. And then anytime a genealogy sort of breaks away from that sort of pattern to highlight something, it's like usually to highlight, and by the way, this guy conquered this city, or this guy, sort of a little detail that sort of shows like, see how important I am. The genealogy almost does the opposite, right? And when it breaks that pattern of father, son, it does it by highlighting women that most people would want to ignore and dismiss. And so it's almost like a lens of Bathsheba is a way of just looking at all the ways in which God is doing that in his genealogy. And I think in a way that's important for us to see. Yeah.
Are there certain ways that you will, and I think the use of language in the way that we describe our story, are there ways that you intend to use language such that it, I don't know, I think there's a part to understand how, like what the result and how the narrative resolves. Yeah. Right. So, so there is a question that I think based on the translations, maybe not even on the translations, based on historical preaching, maybe from the West. I don't know everything that comes up from the East, central parts of the world, African narratives, Asian narratives, but at least Western narratives, right? And the way that they preach and interpret the story of Bathsheba, are there ways that you'll tease out some of the language to try to resolve some of those interpretations? So that was sort of my first question, is to go, as you tease out the narrative, and as we're thinking about the story from the perspective of Bathsheba, there's not a lot of clarity, but there are things there in ways that, David sent his man to have her brought to him. Then he took her and slept with her. Does that turn into she made a decision, or is there something that people need to feel about what that would have been like, what that experience would have been like? And then when she gets to the end of her, towards the latter years of her life, and she's a queen because David makes her that way, what then becomes of that, right? Does she have a choice in becoming queen? Now she gets to enjoy some things, but does that take away the pain she had to experience in losing a child, and then going forward from there? And then how that resolves in, hey, she is featured in this genealogy that typically does not feature women. And so what should we make of that? Again, all in response to the way it's typically and historically preached in our circles.
And I think go ahead.
No, you go.
I was going to say, he does talk about that, like him taking her after she mourns, like she's going through. Is that what you were about to?
I was going there, yeah.
Yeah, that she, like, after her time of mourning, her husband, the loss of her husband, now she's, queen. He brings her to be his wife, but then all of a sudden, now the rebuke to David, now she has to mourn the loss of her son because she doesn't get to keep this child either. Yeah. Like, this woman goes through so much that we don't highlight in the story, but then even towards the end of her years, as you were talking, when David is about to die, she's like pleading for her son, like, yo, give my son Solomon the thrones, because if not, they're going to kill us. Mm-hmm. And so, you just see so much fight in this woman, and you see so much, like, just, I don't know. So I don't know where you're about to go with that, but
that's super helpful. That's super helpful.
Yeah, I was going to say that actually, verse 26 in 2 Samuel 11, when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she lamented over her husband. Yeah. And when the mourning was over. So, like, again, going back to the idea of having people feel, death, pain, heartache, losing a husband, losing, a son, all these types of things. It's pretty interesting to see. Even just in the woman that we talked about already, but I don't know, maybe even doing like a somewhat of a biblical theology to show, like, man, look at all the women that have lost a husband or lost a, loved, like, losing anybody is hard, but let alone a husband or spouse. And there's just there's some stuff that I think to show to, it'd be good.
And I would say even then, if we put it in today's context, we have that whole, like, Me Too movement, right? Like the whole Me Too, where all of these women who Church too. Right? Me Too in the church. Me Too in the church. Because when you look at the Me Too movement, it's about women who were, in these particular careers, and they're being approached by these men in power who are taking advantage of their power. And so when I look at Bathsheba, like, she would fit in that context. Like, this is a man of power, David, abusing his power and taking someone, and we don't know, but that could be the case. Like, maybe she gave into it because, like, dude, like, this is the king. If I don't do this, like, that's my head.
That's what I would be thinking.
Yeah,
I think that's even great. That's great too that you even bring that up, because you think often what happens is, as people look at the end of the story and see that, oh, but she's queen now. Look at all that money she has access to. Look at all that privilege she has now. Yeah. They then interpret it and go, oh, well, maybe actually it was her fault just because there's something on the end that looks like.
You think that's what's happening?
It was, I think sometimes. Yeah. Again, I can't be clear, but in the way that it's preached, when you read the language of it, right? If you just read the language, it sounds like David did, David ordered, David took, David did, right? And then when you look at the end, when Nathan comes, Nathan says, you are guilty. Right. And that's where we get Psalm 51. Correct. Yeah. Right? There's not any language in there that suggests, as I read it, that Bathsheba in some way played a part to gain what she gained. Right? Yeah. And in the end, it almost seems like
David, I guess some people would say, like, some people, an argument against that, I guess what they would say, well, it takes two to tango.
Sure. But again, here's the thing about that. So if you take women who are approached by powerful men and succumb to that abuse of power, right? And then in the cover up or in some sort of, series of events, they end up in a higher position than they were before. Then people will take the assumption that, oh, they must have done something also. But I don't necessarily think that has to be the case. Yeah. Especially if you consider the way women in these positions are, who almost fear coming out or saying something because of the, repercussions from the man, right? Could David have, and maybe her coming out and saying, hey, I'm pregnant was in part that, right? He took her, he slept with her, then sends her back home, right? And then she sends him word and goes, hey, I'm pregnant, right? And maybe that was the only option to say something of the matter of, hey, you can't just leave me out here, right? You can't just leave me alone. You can't have just taken me.
You can't forget me.
You can't forget me.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Dang.
And I wonder how much we think about that, at least that angle of it from a compassion standpoint.
Yeah.
Right. Before taking all of the stories and all the narratives that seem to always paint her in a way that could sort of like undermine her value.
Okay. I'm with it.
Pastor V, I know you're probably, you're obviously still in the
earlier
stages in this, but in terms of application for, our people, what are some things from this story that I guess you want to highlight or kind of takeaways, I guess, in terms of this whole story?
Right now it's pretty simple. I'll develop more as time goes on, but I think I'm again in many ways sort of looking at this as the capstone to the whole series.
Yeah.
Here's a story of someone who gets swallowed up by the people around her in a way that makes her easily, in some ways, sort of forgotten in terms of like, we know who Bathsheba is, but forgotten as like as a person,
right?
Exactly right. As like someone with her own identity and feelings and thoughts, and
right.
I think you guys sort of have really convinced me even more so now that just how much, she's in the sin of adultery, but she's like pulled into it, like in a way that almost like she's by the circumstances around her, like so many people, sadly, right, who get pulled into situations that really are the fault of the people around them, right? And so how she gets pulled into these sort of scenario, and yet what God does with it. I think that I want to sort of speak to what God does with each of our stories,
right?
And to sort of, I was talking to someone today who's sharing with me just being afraid about the future, like he's doing well, but afraid that like the floor is going to fall out from under him, and then that like it's he's struggles in the past, but worried that like I can never count that it's gonna last, right?
Yeah.
So always afraid of that the shoe will drop and I'll fail again. So how can maybe I should just get it over with, kind of, right?
Wow.
And so how the Lord sort of takes all of our histories and wants us to know that if God's able to do that with our past, right? Redeem our past, right? And use them in a way that He's used these women, He can do the same for us, and also that speaks to our future. Right. There's nothing coming up that is so far out of God's sort of hands that He can't use for glorious things, for good things. The key is to the degree which we are also tied to Jesus, that we are connected by spiritual birth to Jesus as well. And so I think that makes all the difference for what we think about how we sort of continue to wrestle with our past and think of how it affects us today, but then how that builds us sort of the kind of hopefulness and sort of way in which we can have courage and wisdom and boldness for the future in a way that we could speak against the lies of the enemy, which was to say that, well, yeah, you because these things happen, you're always going to be seen this way.
Yeah.
So Bathsheba, you're always going to be seen this way. And God says, no, like here's the last word on Bathsheba in the Bible.
That's good.
Part of the genealogy of Jesus.
That's great.
That's good.
It's great on that because that goes back to the passage in Romans that you talked about, God being for us and nothing being able to separate us. And then you even look at the redemptive nature of Jesus when that adulterous woman, the woman caught in adultery, was thrown at His feet and what He did with her.
Yeah.
And you can almost look at the same stories and go, here's Bathsheba, that people would be like, look, a woman caught in adultery. And you go, look at the way people would typically tell that story. And you go, yeah, but look what God did in Jesus' genealogy. And then look what Jesus did when a woman was thrown at His feet who was caught in the act of adultery. And He does the same sort of redeeming thing. Still, go and sin no more. But hey, where are your accusers?
Yeah.
Right. And so that sort of redemptive nature, I love that.
Yeah. That's good. Thank you, guys. It's helpful.
Good stuff, man. All right. Well, this was good, as always. As we always say, love God, love people. You're out.